All right, hi everyone. We're back in action, live and direct, coming at you from my basement once again. And today we're going to be talking a little bit more about indicators. I want to especially sort of pique your interest by taking a look at a very specific map, one that I'm intimately familiar with, but some of you may not be very well aware of. What is this? And take a look. Hopefully this is not too particularly blurry, but of course on the top left we've got a very clear logo here of something that says Paris. That's right, this is the Paris Metro and RER, a regional train map. So you can see this is Paris. We've got the Seine River here. Here's Ile de Paris and all the beautiful areas here with the lovely buildings. We've got Notre Dame here, and then all throughout Paris, all the other wonderful places that you can visit, and hopefully maybe someday soon we'll all be able to go back to. I raise this to your attention not because I want you to learn all the stops on the Paris subway, but because I think this is a great example of something that we are ultimately going to be considering for the rest of the semester. No, not transit concerns, but modeling. Does this map tell us everything that there is to know about Paris? Is this a map of Paris that is photorealistic, that would allow us to, go from one person's apartment to another? Probably not. Could we use it to get from, say Notre Dame to, I don't know, the Gare du Nord, right? If we were to take a train up to the north or something? Well, it might get us closer than if we didn't have the map in the first place, right? We'd be able to get on a metro stop here or something, go to one of these big metro stops here, Châtelet-Léal, and then take a train up to the North Station to be able to get out of the city. So in that sense, while this might not tell us everything there is to know about Paris, where the best, crêperie is, where the best cheese is to be had, what this tells us is something that's intended for a very specific purpose. It's for getting us from one place to another. And one thing that we need to think about related to last discussion is the question of the validity of these indicators, right? If this map, we're saying that Gare du Nord, or the north train station, the northern train station is down here, at the bottom of the map, I would immediately first determine whether or not I'm reading it upside down, but also, if I weren't, I would start to think to myself, is this a really good subway map? Because I'm pretty sure that the north station is north of the Seine River and not the other way around. And so if I had even a little bit of content knowledge about where I was, if I saw a map that had these things in the wrong places, I might start to question whether or not this was a good map or not. It's based on valid indicators if we can look at this map and get a general sense that things are more or less where they're supposed to be. So this is really one of the ways that we can assess an indicator. Right, if this map is sort of a model, it's an abstraction that provides us with some useful information about a phenomenon, it's really similar in many ways to the kinds of measures that we're going to be using in our studies. So for example, the Reporters Without Borders statistic that I was talking about last time, right? We've got this index which tells us generally how free or not free is a country's press. And so if we were to look at an indicator like that, we might ask ourselves, is this valid? Is this an indicator on which we can rely? Some of you are also maybe thinking about your own measures, like measures, for example, of economic productivity, measures of democracy, right? How democratic a country is, right? How robust the legislation is in a state in terms of their a variety of different outcomes. So maybe their ethical treatment of animals, for example, right? If we had a state ranking from 1 to 50 on some of these scales, we might want to ask ourselves, is this something that makes sense to us? Does it look like they're in the right order? So for example, if we were to have a democracy indicator which places the United States like along the bottom 5 countries in the world for democratic quality. Now, I mean, we can all be critics of American democracy, but I mean, there's probably a few countries out there in the world, at least 5, that are less democratic than ours, right? Even if you had the most cynical interpretation of American democracy, based on what we know about democracy, we would probably think to ourselves that we're a little bit more democratic than some of the countries, at the real bottom of this list, like North Korea, like Turkmenistan, like Belarus, right? We're probably more democratic than those countries. And so if we saw something where this ranking was really not where it's supposed to be, we might become suspicious. We might say, this seems like maybe like an indicator that's not being produced using the highest quality kinds of measures. And so that's face validity, essentially. Looking at some of the case scoring, and based on our content knowledge, our intimate content knowledge, starting to ask questions about the validity of cases. We might also think about something called content validity, which is essentially how well concept and variable fit together. So again, this gets us back to some of the questions that we referred to earlier about the selection of our concepts, right? Again, if the RSF or the Reporters Without Borders measure is not close to our conceptualization of what we're trying to get at, it's not going to be very useful. So, for example, political participation, if we were interested in that, we might look to see if people have voted or not, but really that's only one very small, actually, piece of the puzzle when it comes to political participation. So instead we might think about a more content-valid scale being something that includes other kinds of participatory acts, like whether or not people have written letters to their representatives, whether or not they've attended protests or rallies, all kinds of a richer sort of set of potential participatory acts. And so content validity might be another way that we could assess whether or not we're getting closer to a good measure. There's some other ones that we might think about. One is predictive validity, which is essentially to say if we have a known case that we know something about in terms of our qualitative case knowledge, does this indicator, if we were to apply it broadly, does this do a good job of predicting the features of a known case? Another example that we could look at in terms of predictive validity would be if I were to try to apply that same content code from the last video when I'm classifying tweets. If I were classifying tweets and I wanted to know about the features of this a known tweet, like the one with the sarcasm in it that I referred to last time, if it's getting that thing backwards, I might look at this and say, it's not predicting accurately this tweet that I know is a negative tweet, and therefore I don't think that this is a very good measure. Another one might be convergent validity, which is, again, whether or not our measures are correlating strongly with some other well-known measures of related concepts. So, for example, the reporter's score. If my reporter's score is diverging, massively with count data that we have out there for the number of deaths of reporters around the world, right? We might say, oh, it's really weird that the reporter score is giving really positive ratings to countries where there have been many persecuted or killed reporters, right? That kind of thing would mean that it really clashes with existing measurements that are good measures of a related concept. And so if we don't have good convergent validity, then again we can ask ourselves the question, is this actually a good indicator? And then finally, discriminant validity, which I think is also interesting, right? Does this indicator diverge from high-quality indicators of dissimilar concepts, right? So again, if we're looking at, for example, a new democracy score, if that democracy score, high values on that score tend to correlate really strongly with autocratic measures, a measure of autocracy or a measure of limits on civil rights or something, or civil rights abuses, then that would mean that our score is really operating in the wrong direction, right? And so we want to know if this score is opposite from, right, going in the opposite direction of a scale on a dissimilar concept. And so all of these different kinds of measures of validity are all useful heuristics, useful shortcuts for us to evaluate the kind of thing that we're creating, if we're building a scale from scratch or if we're using a new scale that we haven't really had a lot of familiarity with, right? It's going to be really important for us to take a look at some of these numbers, figure out how they're determined. That might be a really big piece of this puzzle, is to figure out how exactly is it that you measure this thing in the first place, and then B, comparing this to other scores that we know are valid, or for example, engaging in some of these face validity or predictive validity sort of tests of specific cases to figure out if we're onto something. So one thing that I think is a really interesting way that we could examine validity is through the evaluation criteria of different courses, right? So that's actually a very interesting way to think about this, is from the perspective of educational statistics. So for example, the SAT, right? Is the SAT a good valid measure of knowledge, I think is a really interesting thing, or a good valid measure of somebody's essentially academic achievement. Because certainly a lot of universities out there are using it for admissions decisions. And so if you ask that question, you suddenly arrive at the conclusion that there are sort of face valid or predictive validity misses, where the SAT scores are actually not doing a good job of predicting who's going to be successful in college. Then you might ask yourself, why are these biases coming into the system? How is it that this score is failing us in making, good predictions of college performance? And so a lot of universities actually have asked that same question, have evaluated the validity of the SAT in predicting the performance of their students. And while, again, I think that this is at least a somewhat useful measure, there are many cases in which, again, it's not actually providing really strong predictive validity. And actually, some colleges have begun to abandon the use of the SAT as a required metric for college admissions. And so this is the kind of thing, right? This has practical importance for everybody's lives, but it also has practical importance, of course, for your research as well. So think again about the measures that you're planning on using. In the next video, I'm going to teach you about how to actually go about finding some of these measures, finding data out there in the real world. So stay tuned for that. I think it's going to be a very important one. And I'll probably be on my WebEx and probably even potentially live streaming, just looking through some of these sources. So you'll be able to come online and follow along with me as I investigate some of these repositories for data that could be of use to your project. So get ready for that, and until then, have a wonderful afternoon, have a wonderful morning, noon, night, whatever time it is that you're watching this, and I look forward to hearing from you in office hours soon. Take care. This is my life now.